Right, so good evening, afternoon, morning to everyone. Thanks for joining in. I promised talk about the risks and rewards of large language models, which I'll be calling LLMs today, and specifically trying to situate that within the open science research movement slash landscape. This was at the time when I wrote the abstract, and I thought, yeah, I can really give a really nice balanced risk reward overview. Unfortunately, oh, there we go. Unfortunately, this is going to skew maybe a bit more to the risks side of things. Not that I want to just have this be a doom and gloom discussion, but maybe just to get everyone prepared that it's maybe not as balanced as I'd initially set out. But hopefully we still walk out of here with a very sort of pragmatic view of the use of LLMs in research. So maybe just let's take a step back and set the scene, and just think about, as I've stolen from Frank Herbert here, thinking machines or AI, LLMs, ChatGPT, just kind of thinking about them more in sort of just general science and the world we live in and so on. And maybe I'm a little bit bold to say this, but they probably represent really this really big revolution in the way we can do science. AI, the concept of AI and LLMs, probably sort of, I don't want to say akin, but thinking about like having computers be an accessible everyday thing for researchers and allowing us to do complex calculations, right? This is sort of like that next step. This is really potential innovation that's happening. But of course, when you have expansion of potential space, we also need to be aware of what those boundaries should be and everything. So I'm not going to like call for the Butlerian jihad quite yet, but I do sort of want to really create that bit of, let's call it skepticism, when we think about AI slash LLMs. So like I've sort of already hinted at, is AI LLMs have really become a commonplace feature just in our cultural zeitgeist, right? I mean, it's in the news every other day. Companies are using it. People are using it. I mean, everyone's aware of AI chatbots. Every time you try contact customer service, you need to talk to a chatbot for 10 minutes first and so on. So it really is the thing that everyone is using and so on. And like I said, we really need to think about how access to these kind of tools is integrating with the way we do science. And like I've said many times before, that's sort of my goal today, is I really want to stimulate thought and discussion within this idea of LLMs within the way we do science. Again, trying to go for balance, not necessarily good or bad, but just more perspective-based. Just a little bit of housekeeping as well before I jump in. I really want to limit the discussion to LLMs specifically, not AI as a broader concept, although obviously if the discussion bleeds into that, that's fine. But my sort of discussion is really much more centered on LLMs. And when I'm talking about LLMs, that's things like ChatGPT and so on, these large language models where I don't say they are capable of like sounding like humans, but it's basically just language processors. So this is not like weird conceptual maths, like neural trees, neural networks, and things like that, or deep learning as an example. I'm really just thinking like, let's think ChatGPT. And also, I don't necessarily want to open the discussion to go into how we can use AI in terms of methods as well, because obviously that is like its own space and scope. So really just thinking about how we do science. Before I jump into that discussion, though, I do actually want to reintroduce myself, but a little bit more about me in terms of like how I fit in the science research landscape. And what I really why I'm doing this is I want to use it as both a bias and a privilege check, because obviously these are a lot of my thoughts and opinions, and so they're going to be shaped by my biases and opinions on things. And so here you can see I graduated in 2024, which when I got my PhD. And so the reason I bring that, let's go through the rest. I also really like perspective style work, and let's call it bigger picture thinking, but also like really digging into the detail of things. And also, I do a lot of computational work, so developing of code and software. And so I really, really enjoy things like coding, which is, I know, not everyone's favorite thing. Also, a lot of things I'll be leaning on today is going to be talking about the coding space. So apologies in advance. And so the reason I bring up the year I graduated is that a lot of my training as a researcher, as a scientist, sort of occurred in, let's call it the pre-chat GPT era. It's not something I was really ever exposed to, except for, as it's become more and more popular. So I've never used it as a learning tool, as a lot of students, I think, do now, especially younger students at school and so on. But I'm also at that sort of newer age side of things in terms of generationally, right? But I haven't had a lot of exposure in terms of like teaching students and so on. So I'm sort of like this very weird sort of transition phase. But yeah, so that's obviously going to shape my perspectives on the use of ChatGPT. I also want to point out that I am a postdoc. I'm in a well-funded position. There's a lot of funding. I also have the advantage I don't have a lot of teaching responsibilities, so I have a lot of time on my hand. So I can dedicate 3 weeks to trying to find a bug in my code base because I have the time and the freedom/leeway to do that in my position. Additionally, I am in the sort of fortunate position where I have a lot of publications to my name for my career stage. So in terms of that pressure to produce a lot of work, I don't have that like leaning over my shoulders. And also, although it doesn't always feel like that to me, I am a native English speaker, which I'll bring up later, but I do have the advantage of being a first language speaker within the language that science is typically conducted. So yeah, that's just a bit of like to help contextualize where my head is at when I start bringing these things up. And now we can finally sort of start digging into what we're actually all here for today, which is thinking about LLMs within the research landscape. And so maybe I think the first question we should ask ourselves is why is it so attractive to use things like ChatGPT to help write our code, maybe even write grant applications, cover letters, abstracts, chunks of our papers, whatever. And I think really the big drawing point, right, is it's going to allow us to do things quickly. It's going to allow us to do things we can't do. So here I talk about lack of skill set, and I don't necessarily mean that in like it's a bad or a good thing. It's very, like, it's always challenging to use this language nicely. But, for example, like if you're new to coding in Python, for example, a lot of people can use ChatGPT, for example, to write their code and tell it, write me this, and it writes that. And so it allows you to do that very quickly and rapidly without necessarily needing to know how to use Python, right? And of course, there's potential for automation of things. And why is this so useful for us? Well, there's, of course, the pressure to publish, right? We need to think about the systemic reason why we want to rapidly, quickly complete work, and maybe bypass some of the learning steps to get it done very quickly. And so a lot of the work, or some of the stuff I'm talking about today, actually comes from this paper that I'm a co-author on, which really situates this issue of using of LLMs and how it relates to thinking about our pressure to publish and do science very quickly. And so out of this paper, I've sort of pulled 3 sections or topics of interest, which I won't go through today. So that's, as it says here, scientific hallucinations, how this is going to affect researcher development, and of course, the potential impact this is going to have on researcher reputation. So starting with scientific hallucinations. So it's something I think about a lot as well, is, how is using, ChatGPT to help you, maybe, you ask it a question about a topic or so, and it gives you the answer, right? Is it the correct answer, or is it just presenting an answer that sounds correct? It's not really like alignment faking in the true sense, right? But, ChatGPT has sort of a set of rules and so on that it has to fit into. And so, it's always told to present answers in a very positive way, or it's not supposed to say, I don't know the answer. And so it still gives you an answer, even though there isn't an answer and so on. And obviously this can really bleed into, well, if you were to go and ask ChatGPT a question it doesn't know the answer to and give you an answer, you obviously think that is the answer. So you have this hallucination of what the truth is. And of course, on top of that is, you don't necessarily know where ChatGPT is getting its answers from. What's the data it's being trained on, right? So is it giving you a really old, outdated school of thought? Is it not giving you the newer developments in the field? Or even just like thinking about tools and so on that it recommends. There's you can't evaluate that face value if you get like an answer from ChatGPT in general. And so, like I've said, so it maybe inflates our confidence in our understanding on something we don't really know. And it also actually takes away a little bit of the autonomy of our own actions, right? Because we're now in the passenger seat. We're asking something else to give us the answer. And does that really help us actually improve our understanding of a concept or not really? And I have two examples I sort of want to bring up in my own work. So maybe I should have, when I introduced myself, actually mentioned I am not a big fan of ChatGPT. I'm not a big user. I've used it a handful of times and mostly more as a for funsies exercise. I should also acknowledge that maybe it means I don't use it properly or correctly or optimally. So there is potentially also shortcomings on my side. But anyway, so two like situations where I sort of feel ChatGPT has given me the wrong answer or not given me the full answer. So one of the things I'm busy working on is a big sort of perspective style overview of the way in which we construct food webs. And so at least I'd like to think I have quite a firm grasp on both the history of the field in terms of how it's developed and also where we currently are at. And for funsies, one day I thought, let me just go and ask ChatGPT, what are the ways in which we can construct food webs? And, the answer was this really sort of biased little subset of things, heavily leaning to a very specific subset of networks and a certain field of study and not giving me that bigger picture. But of course, the way it was presented was like, oh, no, here is your answer. And even with a little bit of pushing and prompting, I could never really get it to give me the fuller, bigger picture answer that I was looking for. On the second side, on the coding side, so other things I've been working on is translating code between R and Julia to do something. So I know what I need to do. I just need to translate it from one language to the other. And I have this issue where I'm quite proficient in Julia, but my R has gotten a bit rusty over the years. And every now and then, and they're using, and sort of like, you don't quite understand the logic. And so for funsies, once I say, let me throw the R code into I think it was ChatGPT as well, or maybe it was Gemini, I can't remember, and see if it translates it into Julia for me. I can use that as a base to start off and kick off with. And it did what I wanted it to do, but it ended up using old and outdated packages that aren't maintained anymore. And so it created a lot of dependencies and so on, which is obviously not great in the long term. And so I'd say it also somewhat did not really deliver there. But I have the position where in both of these situations, I kind of knew the answer. I just need a little bit of help to get there. And that kind of brings me to my first sort of food of thought, right? Is I'm talking about our fear of not knowing if the answer is right and saying, well, we can assess if the answer is right. But is that not in itself also, a privilege we have? And it's actually furthering the gap between experts and novices, because what we're saying is, well, people who know what they're doing can use ChatGPT or whatever, but people who don't know shouldn't use it. And so there's sort of, this gap or divide that could potentially grow. I had a thought I wanted to build on this. Where was I going? Okay, no, it's gone. Privilege, knowing, being able to evaluate. But yeah, so I think it's quite challenging. Oh, I remember what I was saying. It's like, a lot of this work goes, you can use an LLM, but, make sure you have an expert that can look at it. And I just think that just further sort of creates a divide, really, because let's say you take a novice person as like, okay, have ChatGPT write this code and then have someone else evaluate it. You sort of bypassed a teaching step that you could have had, right? That novice person could have gone directly to an expert and spoken to them, and you could have bypassed that middle step. And that kind of leads into my next thing, which is thinking about how the use of LLMs is going to potentially influence our development as researchers, and development of crucial skills and everything. Because obviously it allows us to potentially bypass crucial learning steps. And I think that could potentially really have long-term repercussions. And also he has a third point, we're also stepping back from that decision-making process, which is in itself also a very important sort of skill we need as a researcher. So I think let's take another step back here. When I was prepping for this talk, I did a bit of reading and so on. You noticed I've made a few Dune references already. And I came across this really interesting discussion. I think it's Plato's writing, and it's an argument between two gods. So there's Theus, which I might be mispronouncing, which is the creator of writing, and Thamus, which is the king of the gods. And so obviously Theus has invented writing as a concept. And the argument goes, well, in developing writing, we can improve the memory of people because they can now remember more by writing it down. And Thamus argues, or people are going to lose that skill because they no longer need to remember anything because it can be written down. And I think, this falls into that same space when we think about the use of, ChatGPT, LLMs as a learning tool. Is yes, it might allow us to access skills we didn't have previously. Again, just leaning on coding because it's an easy example. I might not be proficient in Python, but I can have it write me a chunk of code in Python. So yeah, it's allowed me to do things I couldn't do previously, but I have not developed and built onto that skill. And so it is a little bit of a dichotomy, right? Yeah, LLMs are opening doors, but at the cost of our own skills that we could be developing. And, as an example of that, and here I lean a little bit more on the teaching, mentoring side of things. So a while back, I had a PhD student that sort of came and sat with me for the day. So they were presenting, sorry, the lights are going to turn off. I need to gesticulate more. They were presenting on some work that they're doing and wanted to develop a little Shiny app just to kind of have a nice, really dynamic little showcase of some of the stuff. I was like, oh yeah, cool, I can help with this. So I have some experience with Shiny, and obviously I knew the work that they were doing. I mean, that was all packaged and ready. It was just a case of putting it into the Shiny thing and create a dashboard. So for those of you that aren't familiar, Shiny is like those really cool slider, the very cool interactive things. If you can change a slider and it's going to change the shape of the graph or something. So it's just very dynamic reactive things. And so we had a day to do this. We had some ideas and everything. And I was like, okay, cool. Yeah, let's do this. And although I've worked with Shiny previously, it's been a while and they've sort of changed some of the user interface and everything. But I have enough of understanding, this is UI stuff, this is backend stuff and all that kind of stuff. And we sort of got there and we had a bit of a time crunch. And so it's like, okay, well, cool. Let's just I know what we need to do. I just can't quite remember how we do the inputs for this. Let's just quickly ask, I think it was Gemini or ChatGPT again, to give us the answers. And it worked really well. It was great. We got things done quickly. Obviously, you do minimum working examples and you build on it and you can build everything. So we got our little app done by the end of the day. It looked really nice. But I think, although we got the job done, I don't think the student walked away having developed a really good skill and understanding of how Shiny works. And okay, maybe it's fine, they managed to have it for their presentation, so we got to the goal. But we really bypassed that cool learning skills development step, to prioritize getting things done quickly and efficiently. And I think that's really a problem we potentially face. And, this comes back again to thinking about pressure to publish and, the time constraints, experienced researchers, which I've been pointing out, we need experienced people to evaluate LLMs and so on. But they're also the people that typically don't have a lot of time because they're caught up in, administrative stuff and so on. And, so again, it's like, oh, it's very quick and easy. Like just tell the student, oh, have ChatGPT ask questions and so on, because they just don't have time. And yeah, I think that's the problem is we are losing this, that learning step and so on for favor of just getting to an output. Yeah, we got it done. It's good. But yeah, it almost drives this isolation, and we're almost losing that mentorship role, which I think is something so cool and so unique to science, right? It's probably one of the few places where you still have that like cool mentor-mentee kind of relationship. And that is sort of what leads me, to the food for thought when we think about how use of LLMs is going to affect research and development. To make it sound, to give it maybe more gravitas than it needs is, in transferring our thinking to the machines, it diminishes us as humans in a way. We lose our humanity. I don't know, that's a bit dramatic, but I think, and part of that is it drives our isolation, right? We just get driven to thinking more like machines and living in our own world, and we're not thinking broader. We're not inviting others to learn from us, and so on. And I think, there might be long-term effects of that because we're not fostering this collaborative, interactive nature of science, because it's like, oh no, you can just sit here, have the computer do it. That's fine. You can do everything by yourself, independently, get things done very quickly. And so how is that, in the future, we're just going to science has become so enmeshed, and are we going to now lose that again? And everyone just does their own little thing and their own little research agenda. So yeah, that's things that keep me up at night. And then the third point that I want to talk about is thinking about reputational risks, as we termed it in the paper. But yeah, that's just thinking, what's going to be public perception of people who use LLMs. So this is a bit more forward thinking in a way, or thinking about potential. And sort of 3 points that I pointed out here on the left is, people who have the ignorant, when I talk about ignorant usage, it's thinking about people who might use some of these tools in good faith, but they're not necessarily realizing the shortcomings and limitations, and sort of intentional propagation of errors and so on. There's also, potential issues where tools aren't really reliable, so there's that reliability failure. They're not doing what it says they should be doing on the box. I think a really fun example to think about that is translations, right? You can throw, again, like translating programs have been there for a while, but I think we all have done it before. You throw something into the translator and it doesn't really articulate what you were saying. For those of us that are bilingual and so on, you're like, well, yeah, but that's not really what I'm saying, and you're not really faithfully translating it and so on. So yeah, the machine's not doing what it should be doing. And it kind of, ties back again to what I've been talking about when I was talking about scientific hallucinations, right? Is it's not giving you the full picture, or it's not telling you, oh, I'm uncertain of this kind of thing. And then, of course, we can't really ignore, the court of public opinion. What's going to happen in 20 years when people find out that you are an AI user, or sorry, LLM user? In 10 years, maybe that's going to be frowned upon, and so on. Or, people using the wrong tools and everything. So there is, as opinions shift on the use of LLMs, that's also going to change people's thoughts and opinions on specific researchers. And that's sort of what leads me to my food for thought when we think about reputational risks. Are LLMs these bridging tools? We think they are, and I've touched on it a lot, but maybe they're actually just driving the gap bigger as opposed to bridging it, because if you think about writing or prompts and so on, you kind of need to know what you don't know to be able to articulate it properly. So yeah, how's that affecting things? And also, again, ability to evaluate and so on. And the final point I have there is thinking about vulnerable users. Again, I wasn't a big fan of the use vulnerable, but I should think of another one. But I did mention translations, right? There are typically, researchers that aren't English native language speakers are ones that would, things like translating apps are what's marketed towards them. But they already are so marginalized in the scientific research landscape, and could they be further marginalized? If public opinion sways, it's like, oh, well, you use an LLM, that's bad, So, how's that going to further sort of marginalize already marginalized communities within, again, the scientific research space? So, I think are LLMs empowering, or is it more that there's a shift of who has the power? And in a way, that shift of power is shifting to those who already know, because it's come up a lot, right? It's all about, well, if you know enough, you can evaluate it and know it's garbage or not and everything. So yeah, it's not necessarily, it's a power shift, not necessarily an empowering thing. So yeah, that's sort of thinking about, just LLMs and science and, what are some of the risks to that? And to kind of close that out, I want to take a bit of a step back. And I'm not advocating that we need to be Luddites and be completely anti-LLMs, although I will admit I do sometimes feel like I probably fall into that category. But I do think we need to be quite cautious with our adoption of these emerging tools and so on. And especially, if we think about, and how I said earlier, are you using these tools to chase the next, scientific breakthrough, to chase the next paper and so on? Is that really a good enough justification to be using this? And again, like I said earlier, that's about privilege as well in positions you're in. I might be able to say, I don't want to do that. I have the time to do that. Not everyone has that. And so maybe as like a secondary thing, we need to think about that moral high ground that could emerge, which, kind of goes back a little bit here to the reputational things. But, we should also be careful not to look down on people or, either way around and so on. I think there's a lot of bigger sort of questions about this, like, I almost call it societal, but yeah, the social side of the sciences as well. But yeah, I don't think we need to be no LLMs. Like I said, I'm not calling for Butlerian jihad, but cautious is what I would say. And then I did also promise thinking about this in the open science landscape. And so here I sort of termed it more the ethics side of things, although I by no means could claim to be an expert on ethics. So this word's doing a lot of heavy lifting, but yeah, I just want to sort of think about, how do we, fit this into that open science landscape? And I'm sure most people are sort of aware with the principles of open science, but it's about, transparent, accessible, reproducible work. And so I sort of sat down again and thought, how do I discuss that in the space? And so I sort of thought about thinking about the transparency, accreditation, and the accessibility of the use of LLMs. Obviously, there is very much a Venn diagram and the circles are overlapping, so I might repeat myself a little bit every now and then. But yeah, let's jump in. So I think first off, from a transparency aspect, I think it's critical, almost non-negligible, that we have to be open about the use of these tools. And I think even if it is about generating code or stuff like that, it gets a bit messy with writing, right? Because I can definitely see a world where you're like, okay, just give me a draft, because it's easier to edit a draft that exists, that doesn't exist, or whatever. I give it key points, it fleshes it out, and so on. So it's a bit of a fine balance, where do we draw that line? But I do think, at least in things that are really actionable, like code, for example, we need to really be able to showcase, or at least say, this is what I use, these are the prompts I use, this is the output I got, even if it's an intermediate, and this is how I've modified it, kind of thing. And that's just about, being transparent, one, about the use, but also in a way, arguably, the reproducibility aspect of it, in a way, if you squint. And yeah, I think that sort of leads into, how do we make the usage of LLMs reproducible? So obviously, these models have some built-in randomness to them. So they shouldn't necessarily give you the same answer every time you ask a question. There are ways, obviously, to hush that randomness, kind of like a set seed, so you should get the same answer. But yeah, that is obviously an important thing we need to think about. And I do bring it up a little bit later, but I think where there is a very cool potential avenue to think about, and this is why I brought up the reproducibility, is like, let's say we want to do literature reviews. like how you have to give these are the search terms I gave, and this is what I got when I looked at Web of Science. Is there a way maybe we can think about like literature reviews and overviews with these sort of LLMs, but of course, then we need to also make them reproducible. Accreditation, of course, we need to think about both the data going in as well as the actual data coming out. How do we give accreditation? How do we cite, ChatGPT and what the data it is built on? And I mean, if you want to go even bigger, can we actually cite the ideas generated by an LLM? Is it, able of consenting to its ideas being used? Can we actually even cite it? Which is, like I said, that's a bigger question, but it is one we need to think about. And yeah, I think that is where it also becomes challenging, right? Because we don't really know the reasoning behind decisions that are made, and so on. And that, of course, also means like who's held morally accountable? Is the AI held or the LLM held morally accountable, or is it us as the user, as the researcher? Whose idea is really who's responsible for an idea? So yeah, that's sort of a fun one to try and wrap your head around, but that does like lean into, saying we need to talk about having used it, but then also how do we cite it? I mean, I guess like with building code, it's somewhat easier. You just say, I use this, that's what I asked, and so on. But when we come into the idea generation space, how do we deal with that? And this is maybe taking a step back to the data side of things. But also, one of the things we need to think about is like, are these LLMs built on ethically sourced data? So I know it's a really big discussion in the generative AI space of those models being trained on images that aren't necessarily, or that have their copyright essentially violated or their use agreement license violated. And so that's sort of, a big thing to also think about, just again, from an ethics perspective. Can we trust that the data that is used is ethically sourced and properly cited and so on and so forth? Leaning onto the third point, which is the accessibility side of things. And this bleeds in a lot with my transparency slide, I will admit, when I was thinking about it. It's like, this is really hard to disentangle, but I think at least at face value, one of the things to think about is that we use open access LLM tools. So for example, I think it's ChatGPT, probably all of them, there's the paid version and the unpaid version and so on. And obviously which version you use is going to influence what people can access because they're trained on different data sets. And so this does also become a bit of a reproducibility issue because, if you're using the paid version and someone's using the free to use version, you could get different answers even to the same question. So that again, lies a bit with the accreditation and versioning, much like with software, you need to version control as well. But yeah, we also need to think about, there's a big push for using open access tools, and LLMs should fall into that category as well. It is an open access tool then, and you need to be mindful of trying to use open access versions where possible. And like I said, again, sharing of exact prompts used and so on. That got you to that answer. And then yeah, this food for thought side of things is, like I said, this idea of like literature reviews or something. Like there is potential, I think, to help use LLM to sort of troll the big datascape we have, but we also need to think about how we can do that. So yeah, it's like closing off this section is I think it's important that we're proactive about identifying, guidelines about the fair usage of these LLMs within our research. And like I said earlier, there's this expansive space, but being able to contain it. Sorry, the chat's come up and I'm confused by it. All right, never mind. Okay, done. I will read them later. Sorry, I get distracted by these things. All right, and then sort of closing this off, I thought it would be nice to close this off, is thinking about, what can we do instead of using LLMs, or what are ways to, I almost want to say counter, some of the risks that I highlighted earlier before as well. I think there is a happy medium, but between the usage and deciding not to use it. But yeah, how can we sort of actively decide not to use these thinking machines, as I've termed them? And I think most of these won't come as a surprise. I've brought them up a lot and discussed them a lot. But the first one is, I think I've spoken about this narrowing down of the way in which we do research and how, LLMs can really facilitate this idea of isolation and doing work by yourself. But should we rather not, instead of saying, oh, well, I don't know how to use Python, I'm going to use LLM, why not rather engage with someone else and grow your research network that has those expertise, and you call them and ask them, hey, can you help me with this? And so, yeah, like I said, it's like shifting your head from not using LLMs to do everything, but rather how can I help other people how can other people help me to do things? And yeah, like I said, invite them into your project. Bonus points if they're ECRs, right? That's a really cool opportunity for them. And I threw this in here as a final point, but also it then also ensures that they are compensated in some way by bringing them into your team. I think, like, I personally have a lot of issues with using of generative AI personally, and I think there's a lot of space to rather engage with actual illustrators. Or, I mean, it's happened to me before, is I've actually been called on to help with a project because I have an illustrative background, or I don't call it a background, but and again, I get compensated by being part of the research team, and I also get that accreditation. So I think that is, to me, a much more fair kind of system to think about. And yeah, I think it again really helps us to move away from that isolation and rather think about collaboration again and keeping the space open and wide in which we work in. The third point is also flipping it around. What about sharing your skills and creating space for people to be able to access your skills in a way? And here I'm focusing a lot on the mentorship side of things, right? There's very little, like I've said many times before, it's very rewarding to actually work with someone, work alongside a mentor and learn with them, as opposed to sitting and looking at a machine and getting answers from the machine that aren't really personal. There's a lot more growth to be had. And I guess I should again caveat both of these points beforehand. Inviting people onto your research team has potential costs, maybe not. But like I just said, getting illustrators, that comes with a monetary cost. So again, I understand how that is a barrier to people. And it's the same here with sharing your skills, right? I've mentioned people generally, the more of an expert you are, the more in demand your time is. So you don't necessarily have the time to be a mentor. And so, yeah, again, there's this trade of things. And then sort of my final third point, which is because I am a dreamer, call me a bit of that, is don't you want to fall in love again with the process of learning and discovery? I feel like the use of LLMs really sanitizes that, and you lose that creative exploration, sort of mistake-making space. And I don't know, maybe I speak for myself. There are days where it's really frustrating when you can't find the bug, but there is also something really enjoyable and rewarding, about finally understanding why something doesn't work the way it should, or getting to a solution to a problem you've been working on so long. And I think we really need to focus on cultivating that curiosity and interest. We shouldn't be stifling it with these impersonal tools and so forth. So I've referenced Dune a lot. I kind of want to shoehorn it in once more, just a little quote. This is in the third book, for those of you that have not read Dune. So the films aren't here yet. There's this quote from Nita too, which is, humans had set those machines to usurp our sense of beauty, our necessary selfdom, out of which we make a living judgment. And I think that really just encapsulates a lot of what I've spoken about today, right? AI is just, it sanitizes everything, and it takes away our capacity to judge. Like I said earlier, our agency almost in the decision-making process. And although I haven't touched on it a lot today, but I think it's kind of sad how we get AI to do all this fun, creative stuff for us. I've touched on generative AI, having it draw up pictures. I mean, there's nothing nicer than drawing pictures. And going more into the arts, when you listen to directors, I can't remember who it was they were interviewing, but they were also talking about, I think it was like transitioning between scenes. It's like, oh, well, it's so nice. You have these two ideas. You have AI write the transition between scene 1 and 2. And they sort of responded with like, but no, that's the joy in it. That's what I enjoy the most, is working out how am I going to transition between scene 1 and 2. I don't want something to do that for me. It's what I enjoy. And I think that is really what I think we also need to think about, and that's sort of what I want to close out with today is, what made you fall in love with being a scientist, right? It's about the process. It's about learning. It's about discovery. It's about creating in a way, right? Science is creative in its own way. It's not about the outputs. It's not about, like there is obviously a reward, if you're in like the medical research field, like developing a vaccine that is effective is obviously a great output. That is output you want, but it's the process that gets you there that is also just as enjoyable. And it's not about just chasing papers, chasing publications, and so on. So I think, there's a bigger discussion, how do we try and take away the systemic pressures that push for the use of LLMs and allow us the space to also know I don't want to use it because I like this enjoyable phase of struggling with a coding language and so on. But I think I thought I would end on this sort of bit of open, maybe optimistic note. Thank you for everyone for your time. And I look forward to hearing thoughts and ideas, maybe just in terms of how I hope this discussion will go. So we don't have too much time. It's a bit longer than I thought. But it would be really cool to just get some thoughts and discourse and so on going. Obviously, again, I'm not pretending to have the answers, and it would be cool to hear other people's thoughts and opinions. With that, should I hand over back to our host?
Thank you very much, Tanya.